February 13th, 1542. A young queen, barely 19, is led to the scaffold inside the Tower of London. She is Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. In silence, she kneels on the block. The axe falls. Her body is said to have been buried in the chapel just steps away, beside her cousin, Anne Boleyn. But here's the mystery. 3 centuries later, when Victorians lifted the chapel floor to study the graves, they found Anne. They found Jane Boleyn. They found others too. But Catherine? Nothing. Not a single bone. Not one tooth. Not even dust where she should be buried. It was as if Henry's doomed young bride had simply vanished. So what happened to Catherine Howard's body? Was she lost to time, destroyed by lime, or secretly moved? And beyond the mystery of her remains lies an even real question. Was she really guilty of the betrayal that condemned her? Or was she simply a girl chewed up by power? And now, even in death, she refuses to be found.
If you found this story interesting, hit like so more history lovers can discover it too.
The knock came on a chilly autumn morning in 1541. Catherine Howard, still radiant in silks and jewels, was taken from Hampton Court Palace. Soldiers surrounded her. She was no longer the king's beloved wife. She was a prisoner. The news spread fast. Henry VIII's young queen, arrested for adultery, the same charge that killed her cousin Anne Boleyn. Courtiers whispered. The king raged. Catherine cried out, begging Henry to hear her, to let her explain. But he would not listen. That same night, she was moved to Sion Abbey, a grim house of confinement. She was not allowed visitors. Letters were intercepted. Guards watched her day and night. Henry, once besotted, now called her a traitor. But as Catherine sits in her cold chamber, awaiting judgment, we must ask ourselves, was she truly guilty of adultery, or was she guilty of something else entirely? Something that made her a target long before she ever set foot in Henry's bed. To understand what really happened to Catherine Howard, we need to go back. Back to before the crown, before the palace. We need to go back to when she was just a child.
Catherine Howard was born around 1521 into the powerful but often troubled Howard family. Though her bloodline tied her to dukes and courtiers, her immediate household was far from wealthy. Her father, Edmund Howard, was a younger son with little money or influence. Her mother died when Catherine was still a child, leaving her without the steady guidance a young girl desperately needed. She was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess kept a grand house, but it was no safe haven. Dozens of young girls were crammed together in dormitories, often left unsupervised. Rules were few, discipline was weak, and the atmosphere was dangerously permissive. Men moved freely through the chambers, secretaries, tutors, visitors. The young girls became easy prey. Catherine, lively, cheerful, and pretty, drew attention quickly. At only 13, she caught the eye of her music master, Henry Manox. He was older, and he flattered her with gifts and whispered promises. His touches crossed boundaries she barely understood. Too young to resist, too inexperienced to know her own danger, Catherine became entangled. Not long after, another man stepped into her life, Francis Derham. He called her his wife in secret. He took liberties, gave her the sense of belonging she craved, yet claimed rights over her she could not refuse. The line between affection and coercion was blurred, perhaps even erased in that reckless household. What happened there would haunt Catherine forever. Years later, Those early indiscretions would be dug up, twisted, and used as proof that she was unfit to wear a crown. But for now, fate had other plans. She was plucked from obscurity and placed at court, where her beauty shone brighter than ever before. And in those glittering halls, she caught the gaze of the most dangerous man in England, Henry VIII.
By the time Henry met Catherine, he was not the handsome prince of his youth. He was heavy, aging, and plagued by illness. But more than his body, it was his pride that carried deep scars. His latest marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a disaster. Anne had been chosen to secure an alliance with the German states. Yet from the moment Henry met her, he recoiled. He mocked her appearance, calling her a Flanders mare. Worse, he felt tricked, humiliated before his court and before Europe. The King of England, once courted by noble houses across the continent, now found himself bound to a wife he could barely stomach. For Henry, it was more than disappointment, it was shame. He had been rejected in negotiations by powerful families, and when at last a bride was secured, she was not the prize he imagined. His fury burned hotter when courtiers laughed behind their hands, whispering about his unhappy marriage. In the end, he discarded Anne in disgrace. The man who arranged the marriage, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, paid the ultimate price. Within months, Cromwell was executed, proof that Henry's wounded pride could kill as swiftly as any sword. And so, when Catherine Howard appeared, all youth and sweetness, she was everything Anne of Cleves had not been. She was young, where Anne seemed plain. She was affectionate, where Anne had been cold. She made Henry feel alive again, not mocked, not humiliated, but desired. For a king drowning in anger and shame, Catherine was more than a bride. She was redemption. She became the salve for his pride, the jewel to cover his scars, the proof that he was still powerful, still irresistible, still a man to be feared and adored. But in lifting her so high, Henry also placed her in the deadliest of traps.
It was 1540. Henry VIII was nearly 50, obese, diseased, racked with pain from an ulcerated leg that stank and refused to heal. Henry was desperate for another chance at happiness. When 19-year-old Catherine appeared at court, she seemed like a gift from God. He needed Catherine Howard more than she needed him. The king courted her like a teenage boy. Love letters, gifts of jewelry, pet names whispered in her ear. For a girl who had never experienced genuine affection, Henry's attention must have felt intoxicating. They married on July 28, 1540. Catherine became Queen of England at roughly 19 years old. She had gone from abandoned child to the most powerful woman in the kingdom in less than 2 years. At first, Catherine's reign was joyous. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. Courtiers bowed deeply to her, eager to please the young queen. But beneath the surface, enemies circled. In 1541, rumors reached Archbishop Cranmer. He heard whispers of Catherine's past, of her old ties to Francis Derham. Cranmer investigated in secret. The queen's chambermaids were questioned. Details spilled out. One maid admitted Derham had once called Catherine his wife. Another confessed she had seen the two of them together at night. And then came the fatal blow. New whispers linked Catherine to a gentleman of the king's chamber, Thomas Culpeper, a man close to Henry, a man trusted. But the cruel twist was that Catherine didn't lose her life for adultery, but for the secrets she kept about her past. When the truth emerged in November 1541, Henry's investigators built their case methodically. They questioned servants. They examined letters. They tortured prisoners until they confessed. Francis Derham broke first. He claimed that Catherine had promised to marry him, that their relationship was real, but he also threw her under the executioner's axe by suggesting that she had moved on to Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper initially denied everything, but when faced with the king's wrath and the promise of a traitor's death, he admitted to meeting with the Queen in secret. He claimed nothing physical had happened, but he admitted he longed for her favor. Jane Boleyn, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, had facilitated these meetings. Whether she was helping an innocent friendship or covering for an affair became irrelevant when Henry decided that everyone involved would die. Derham and Culpeper were condemned to death for treason. They were executed on December 10, 1541, at Tyburn. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the full traitor's punishment. Culpeper, as a gentleman, was granted the mercy of simple beheading. But what about Catherine herself? Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her in January 1542. The charges were specific. She had concealed her relationships with Manox and Derham from the king, and she had committed adultery with Culpeper after marriage. The evidence for post-marital adultery was thin. Were the two lovers? Did they ever lie together? We cannot know for certain. Their surviving letters speak of longing, but also of fear. Catherine was careless, yes, but was she guilty of adultery? Or was she a lonely girl clinging to a friend in the gilded prison of queenship? But it didn't matter. Henry didn't care. Whether Catherine had committed adultery or not was irrelevant. In Henry VIII's eyes, she was guilty of something far more dangerous. She had lied to him. When Henry discovered Catherine's past, his rage wasn't just about betrayal. It was about humiliation. The great king had been deceived by a teenager. He had been made to look foolish. And Henry VIII never forgave those who made him look foolish. On February 12, 1542, Catherine was told she would be executed the following morning. She spent her last night practicing with the executioner's block, trying to learn how to lay her head properly for the axe. Think about that for a moment. A 19-year-old girl, alone in her cell, rehearsing for her own death. The next morning, February 13th, Catherine walked to Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. She spoke briefly to the small crowd, praying for the king and asking for blessings. Then she knelt, placed her head on the block, and with one stroke of the executioner's axe, Catherine Howard's short life ended. But her story didn't end there, because what happened to her body next would become one of history's strangest mysteries.
When Catherine Howard died, her body should have followed the normal protocol. Executed traitors in the Tower of London were typically buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The small church within the tower walls had become the unofficial cemetery for those who met their end on the executioner's block. Anne Boleyn rested there. Jane Boleyn, Dowager Viscountess Rochford too. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, had joined them just months before Catherine's death. The pattern was established. Important prisoners were buried in the chapel, usually in shallow graves before the altar. Contemporary accounts confirm Catherine was buried within the tower. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London specifically states that both Catherine and Jane Boleyn were beheaded within the tower and there buried. For over 300 years, everyone assumed Catherine rested in the chapel. Her name appeared on memorial plaques. Tourist guides pointed out her supposed grave location. She became part of Tower of London lore. Then came 1876. The Tower of London was undergoing restoration. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula needed major work. The floor was uneven after centuries of burials, and shallow graves had even created health problems. Doyne Courtney Bell, who led the project, decided to carefully record all the famous burials. Old records showed where each person should be: Anne Boleyn near the altar,
Catherine Howard a little to the right, with Jane Boleyn and Margaret Pole nearby. The excavation began with high expectations. This was a chance to confirm history, to match skeletons with names, and to finally answer old questions. They found Anne Boleyn exactly where expected. Her body was present, though many bones were missing, suggesting earlier disturbances. They found a tall male skeleton that matched John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. 2 female skeletons appeared to be Jane Boleyn and Margaret Pole. But Catherine Howard, nothing. No bones, no skull. Had she dissolved into dust? Had her bones been mixed with others? Or had someone moved her in secret? The Victorians were puzzled. They recorded one line that still haunts us today. No remains which could be identified as those of Queen Catherine Howard were found. So where is she?
The disappearance of Catherine Howard's remains sparked theories that persist to this day. Doyne Courtney Bell, who led the 1876 excavation, offered the first explanation. He presents a theory that lime had dissolved Catherine's bones. She was only 19 when she died, he argued. Young bones are softer, more cartilaginous. Combined with the lime used in Tudor burials, Catherine's remains might have simply decomposed over 3 centuries. This theory sounds scientific, but it's wrong. Modern science has proven that lime actually preserves human remains rather than destroying them. The ancient misconception that lime eats flesh and bone away persisted well into the Victorian era, but it's false. If anything, lime should have helped preserve Catherine's body. A second theory points to natural decay. Catherine was barely 20 when she died. Her bones may have been more fragile, more prone to crumble with time. Yet this fails to explain the puzzle. Why did Anne Boleyn's skeleton survive almost intact? Why were Jane Boleyn's skeletons found intact despite being buried on the same day? A third possibility is that Catherine's remains are still there, mixed with other skeletons. The chapel floor is crowded with burials spanning centuries. Perhaps her bones became scattered among other graves, making identification impossible. But the Victorian excavators found distinct burial groups, suggesting the graves had remained relatively separate despite disturbances. A fourth theory proposes mistaken identity. What if the bones identified as Jane Boleyn actually belonged to Catherine? The argument goes that it would make more sense to bury a former queen in the place of honor rather than a mere viscountess. Bell considered this but rejected it based on age estimates and bone measurements. The skeleton attributed to Jane Boleyn appeared to be from someone in their 30s, consistent with Jane's age at death. A fifth theory suggests Catherine was buried elsewhere in the Tower complex. The contemporary sources only state she was buried within the Tower, not specifically in the chapel. But this seems unlikely, given established precedent and practical considerations. The sixth possibility is that the excavation simply missed her grave. The Victorian team dug carefully, but not exhaustively. Catherine's burial might lie just outside the area they examined, or deeper than expected. A seventh theory is more sinister: grave robbing. Stealing remains of famous people was common in previous centuries. Body snatchers, souvenir hunters, and trophy collectors routinely pilfered bones from important graves. But usually this involved taking individual bones, not entire skeletons. A complete disappearance would have required significant effort and secrecy. The eighth and most intriguing theory is that Catherine was deliberately moved at some point between 1542 and 1876. Perhaps her grave was disturbed during later burials. Perhaps someone decided she deserved a different resting place. Perhaps her remains were relocated within the chapel to make room for other bodies. But if so, why Catherine and not others? And why is there no record of such a move?
More than 400 years after Catherine Howard's death, her story continues to fascinate us. But perhaps the real mystery isn't where her body went, it's why we care so much about finding it. Catherine Howard represents something that resonates across centuries. She was young, she was powerless,
She was destroyed by men who claimed to love her.
Her relationship with Henry Manox began when she was a child.
Her involvement with Francis Dereham occurred when she was a vulnerable teenager. Even her marriage to Henry VIII happened when she was barely out of adolescence, facing a king who held absolute power over her life and death. Modern historians increasingly view Catherine not as an adulteress, but as a victim, a girl who was groomed, manipulated, and ultimately sacrificed to protect the egos of powerful men. The charges against her were legally valid, but morally questionable. Yes, she had relationships before marriage. Yes, she failed to disclose them to Henry, but she was operating in a world where women had no agency, where their bodies were commodities, where survival often meant keeping secrets. Thomas Culpeper, the man she allegedly had an affair with, was himself accused of rape in earlier court records. Francis Dereham pressured her into what he claimed was a marriage contract when she was still a teenager. Henry Manox began grooming her when she was 11 years old. These were not romances. They were examples of powerful men controlling a vulnerable girl. Yet Catherine was the one who paid with her life. Her execution served Henry's psychological needs more than justice. He needed to punish someone for making him look foolish. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to send a message to future wives about the consequences of deception. Catherine became that message, written in blood on Tower Green. As for her missing remains, the most likely explanation is also the simplest. She's probably still in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, buried in a slightly different location than the Victorians expected. The chapel is small, cramped with centuries of burials, and the 1876 excavation was limited in scope. Catherine Howard might lie just feet away from where the investigators searched, waiting under later burials, forgotten beneath the stones where tourists now walk and photograph. Will we ever find her? Probably not. The chapel is a working church and royal peculiar. No monarch would authorize the extensive excavation required to solve this mystery. Unless future renovation work accidentally uncovers her grave, Catherine Howard will remain lost. But maybe that's fitting. In life, she was overlooked, discounted, treated as disposable. In death, she has achieved a kind of immortality through mystery. Her absence speaks louder than her presence ever could. Catherine Howard's story reminds us that history is written by the powerful, but truth belongs to the voiceless. She was condemned as an adulteress, but evidence suggests she was a victim. She was labeled promiscuous, but records show she was groomed. She was executed for treason, but died for inconveniencing a king. Her missing body is the perfect metaphor for her missing voice in historical records. We know what men said about her, but we never learned what she might have said about them. In the end, perhaps Catherine Howard got the last word after all. By disappearing, by refusing to be found, by denying us the closure of a confirmed grave, she has forced us to keep looking, keep questioning, keep wondering if we truly understand what happened to the girl who became Henry's fifth wife. She has made herself unforgettable by becoming invisible. And somewhere beneath the stones of the Tower of London, in a place historians cannot pinpoint and archaeologists cannot reach, Catherine Howard keeps her final secret, the truth about what really happened to her in life and in death remains buried with her bones.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold history mysteries.